Hello, welcome to Plant Party. Today is Management Decision Points, hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and fun education. I'm Megan Clayton, professor and extension range specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. My co-hosts are Charles Kneiper, State Resource Conservationist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Tim Sigmund, the Private Lands Program Leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Our door prize donors today are committed to supporting you in your quest to learn more about plants. I'd like to thank Bamert Seed, InView Range and Pasture, Native American Seed, Quail Forever, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these nice prizes. Great. Our first presenter today is Jason Holt. Jason currently serves as the Zone Rangeland Management Specialist for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in Bryan, Texas. In this position, he supports NRCS field offices in East Texas by providing technical assistance and training on livestock grazing and other related land management issues. Jason began his career with NRCS in 2003 and previously worked on the coastal prairie and the Rio Grande Plains before moving to his current position in 2014. Jason is a certified professional in range management and holds a bachelor's degree in rangeland ecology and management, as well as a master's degree in animal science. He will be presenting on grazing considerations for native and introduced grasses. Thanks for kicking off our plant party, Jason.
Thanks, Megan. I sure appreciate it. Well, good morning, everybody. I sure appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. My goal this morning is to just give you a broad overview of some things you might think about from a grazing standpoint when it comes to native species and introduced grasses. So we'll dive right in. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is hit some of these variables or these key topics that we talk about when we talk about a grazing event. And by grazing event, what I want to qualify that by saying is I'm talking about an opportunity when we turn that herd into that pasture. While they're in that pasture, that's the grazing event. And if they happen to rotate out of that pasture, then we're in more what we would call a rest period. Now, the grazing event may last a few hours or it may last year round, depending on how you decide to manage your place. But in that context of a grazing event, we like to think about these variables here on the left side of the screen. The first one being timing, the time of the year that those animals are in there in relation to the growing season is an important consideration. The intensity of the grazing event, by that we're talking about the percent of the plant that's being removed by the grazing animal, whether that's from them grazing it or trampling it or other things. The duration of the grazing event can vary widely. Again, like I'm saying, on some of these intensive systems, it may be a very short duration, or it may be, in a more traditional style management, it might be a long-term grazing event. The herd might be in the pasture a month or even year-round in some situations. If they are rotating in and out of that pasture, the frequency at which they do that is important to consider as well. And I like to add here that the distribution of livestock within that pasture has the potential to impact these things substantially. If you think about a system where the animals always have access to that pasture, but they're stocked very lightly, say a cow to 60 acres or something like that, then there's a lot of flexibility and latitude with these things that we just discussed. But if the distribution of those animals in there is such that we've got, say, 40 cows on 1 acre, then we're on a much thinner margin of how we can manage there and still accomplish our goals. So all those things, I'll leave my last variable here, stocking rate, for last. And that really is probably the largest variable that we control there. The stocking rate is going to drive, again, how much margin for error we have. And what we're talking about is just the number of livestock that are on that property. And so we'll manage their placement with grazing and have, adjust these variables with where they're at. And so that stocking rate is a big deal. If you have way too many animals on a property, all this stuff is kind of out the window. it's very difficult to be successful. But a conservative stocking rate, where we've got, plenty of grass or whatever the livestock we have are consuming, that's extremely important to get right and to try to do so. And that varies throughout the year, depending on whether in a drought or we're above average. So that's something to really try to wrap your mind around and be aware of what a reasonable stocking rate is for the properties that we're managing. So, in that context, there are all these variables we're talking about. We want to be able to answer these questions. What time of the year is the pasture that we're trying to manage can be grazed? If there's, maybe I'm trying to improve the vigor of some plants and I want to rest it in the fall and let them go into the dormant season with a lot of energy. How short am I going to let my livestock graze the pasture? If I'm managing for, fawning cover, I'm going to be very, very careful with my native grasses and try to leave a lot of cover out there, for wildlife. If I'm trying to overseed for winter pasture, I might graze my Bermuda grass very short in October. So, it's going to vary very widely. How long those livestock are in the pasture too is going to drive, the vigor and health of those plants, to some extent, again, depending on how many animals are in that pasture. So that's something we want to think about. And how often am I going to repeat that grazing event? These are just a few of the many questions that you want to be able to answer as you start to formulate your plan on your place and what you might do. And, I'll bring it up again. All these considerations are second to that stocking rate decision on what you're going to do on the property. Okay, so let's move into contrasting introduced species and native species just a little bit. On these introduced species, if we're thinking, these are plants that did not occur in these areas, prior to European contact. Basically, we brought them in for one reason or another. As agricultural efforts have taken place, we look for things that are easy to establish, that are going to be productive and grow lots of forage to be able to, feed the country and beyond. So we've looked for, possibly bringing in plants that might be more productive or give us some more flexibility. So these plants that we brought in, most of them are very easy to establish. Some of them are heavy reseeders. So if we have, a problem with a drought or something like that, and we lose some of those plants, well, I'm going to come back from seed. Most of them have some means of adapting to heavy grazing. And so that's a real important consideration there. If they're adapted to heavy grazing, you have a lot of latitude there with how you might manage those species. So some examples of these introduced species, in terms of bunch grasses, I would throw the old world blue stems in there, like a King Ranch blue stem. Klein grass is a good example. Buffalo grass in the southern part of the state. Those are some of the more common introduced bunch grasses that you're going to see. And, especially in my part of the state that I'm working now, these introduced sod forming grasses are very common. And I'm talking about Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. As you move west, especially Bahia is going to drop off first in terms of adaptability. And you might be able to take Bermuda grass a little ways west of, across I-35 probably, but you got to be very careful there because it's most adapted to these wetter type environments. Okay, so just talking about those two, say your Bermuda grass and your Bahia grass, an important distinction that I like to draw on those sod-forming grasses, one thing that makes them very adaptive to heavy grazing is the way they grow. So you've got Bermuda grass on the left, and you can see that little bottom runner in the picture there. That's an above ground horizontal stem we call a stolon. And that plant does not elevate its growing points or the buds that are on that runner up to where livestock can get to it. So, when livestock graze it short, they're not removing those buds. If you remove the bud, then that plant has to come back from stored energy in the basal buds. That's a lot more taxing on the plant. By the same token, with Bahia grass, that stem is actually just below the soil surface there. So you have a below ground horizontal stem. So it's extremely difficult to damage those buds there. So these two grasses are, extremely adapted to heavy grazing. So this is like a common scene that you may see in this part of the world where I'm at right now. In this example of the pasture, I would say it looks like we can pick out some spot grazing. We're in some heavily used areas, some areas that aren't used as heavy. We have some areas that were used very heavy. We can see some bare ground out there. These livestock might have access to the pasture year round at a heavy stocking rate. And as long as we don't hit, a 2011 style drought, I tend to think of it, these folks are going to rain their way out of trouble. When we get decent rainfall pattern, that pasture is going to recover to some standpoint. They're not going to lose their stand to get grass, or you would have a problem managing natives in that same fashion. So in terms of tactics of managing these introduced species, when you are rotating, I would say you want to carefully monitor your frequency and be aware of the stage growth of that plant. And especially in the eastern part of the state, one thing you really have to watch for is overly mature forage. It's kind of the opposite of what you think about in grazing management. It seems like we're always talk drought, 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 but you get over 40 inches of rain a year and you've got some of these. If you rest it 6 months, you might turn cows in on forage. It's pretty low quality, and that can be an issue. So I would say that, as far as monitoring that frequency, if you're rotating, that's an important thing to master, speed up at certain times of the year, slow down at other times of the year. Intensity is still important for recovery, though, whether we're talking introduced sod forming grasses or bunch grasses. The percentage of the plant that we remove by grazing is still going to impact plant vigor. And the way you like to think about that really is try to leave at least half the leaf on the plant out there so it can photosynthesize and recover from grazing. So on the pro side, I would say on these introduced species, they can be very productive at times. Several of them are responsive to fertility. If you're going to fertilize and you're looking at spending the money, the economics work out, you can grow a lot of grass on a small area with a lot of these species. And then the big thing here, I think, is that they are very forgiving on grazing management. Now, on the cons, you've got a lack of diversity from the standpoint of forage diversity. So you may have a big boom of forage with something like Gordo bluestem that comes on all at one time, and you got to do something with it. Otherwise, 6 months later or even shorter periods of time, you're not going to be able to do much with that because of the quality. So whereas in a diverse stand of grass, we have something growing at different times of the year. I might have something vegetative that has high quality throughout the year instead of all at one time. The big one here with these introduced species is habitat quality. They tend to form monocultures. You don't get the interspace between the plants and the variety of plants and forbs that can lead to high quality wildlife habitat. So if you think you want to plant these, you need to really be sure, because it's very hard to undo and once they're already there. And like I mentioned a couple of times before, forage quality can be an issue at times. It's just you have to build that concern into your management plan. Okay, talking natives, I'm focusing on bunch grasses here, like little bluestem, side oats, grama, and plains bristlegrass. The growth form of these plants is going to be a little bit different than those sod forming grasses I was speaking about. And a lot of them aren't heavy reseeders. So they are, as they grow, and you can see in that little series of pictures moving left to right, as they mature, they're going to elevate their growing points and they're susceptible to being removed by livestock. And if that happens over and over again, that can lead to vigor problems. And you can see this little picture of research has been around for a long time here on the right. If we really remove too much of that leaf, we're going to hurt root growth, and that's problematic from a plant vigor standpoint. So what kind of tactic would you use on these bunch grasses? Again, start with that reasonable stocking rate. And, this is extremely generic kind of prescription here. But the first place we're thinking is, these 4 variables, we want to adjust those so that we're, again, taking no more than about half of that leaf off the plant. And then when you rotate out of that pasture, try to be stocked in a way that you're not getting back around to that pasture until the plant recovers. It's pretty simple, really. Sometimes easier said than done dealing with the weather. but just a good plan. And one thing about planning is I wouldn't tell you, that you don't expect to get the prescription right or exactly what you want to do. The first time you write the plan, all good plans are revised. So, especially if you're new to a property, you'll learn and you will almost teach yourself exactly how that plan ought to be and know like how aggressive you can or cannot be with your grazing. Now, some common problems with rotational grazing and on these natives is if when people rotate around and they are moving pasture to pasture during that grazing event, sometimes they'll think if I'm rotating, I have to make the pasture look even. I have to get the livestock to eat most of what's standing there. That can lead to a lot of problems, definitely on the habitat side, but also on the plant vigor side and on the livestock performance side. You may be forcing those animals to eat something they're having a really hard time to digest. The other thing is too short of a recovery period in a rotational system. We need to be making the rotational moves based on the condition of the plant and not necessarily the calendar. You can plan out how you think you want to move, but sometimes you got to recognize that it may take 30 days for this field to recover in one part of the year. It might take 60 or 90 or 180, depending on what, conditions are like. Okay, so on the positive side, with native grasses, you're going to have a lot more plant diversity out there, a lot more opportunity for habitat quality because they're going to allow forbs and other things to grow in between them. And it's going to be low input. You're not going to fertilize. They're going to stockpile better in the wintertime and provide standing hay out in the field. They are more sensitive to heavy grazing, and depending on where you're at in the situation, it may require a lower stocking rate than if you had introduced species. All right.
Great job, Jason. Next up will be Sawyer Warwick, also with the USDA and RCS. Sawyer is a zone rangeland management specialist located in San Angelo, Texas. His role involves providing support and guidance for rangeland-related practices in 52 counties, an area covering the hill country to the Trans-Pecos. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Resource Management from Angelo State University. Following graduation, Sawyer began his career within RCS. His career path has included multiple offices and roles, allowing him to assist producers across the state of Texas for the past 12 years. We'll turn it over to you, Sawyer, to tell us about drought contingency planning.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning. As Tim mentioned, I'm going to be talking about drought contingency planning, which depending on where you're at in the state, if you would ask, when they asked me to talk about this, like, oh, this is perfect out here in West Texas, we're seeing a lot of drought. And then first week of September, we basically doubled our average rainfall for the year. We got anywhere, depending on where you're at, anywhere from 5 to, I've heard, up to 16 inches in over a week's time. So a lot of places are looking pretty good. However, I was reading a deal from A&M AgriLife this morning that they are projecting La Nina, which I hate to be the bearer of bad news. They've been projecting this all year, but fortunately, the meteorologists, they have been wrong before, so hopefully they are in this. But they're saying that we are in a La Nina watch, and they're predicting a 70% probability of that occurring. So I think drought management is something, when we're talking about grazing livestock, is something that always should be on your mind, regardless of where you're at in the state. And so hopefully I can cover a few things that will help you develop that drought management plan this morning. So this here is the current conditions for Texas. I saw in the chat that some people were from New Mexico and maybe other states, but here in Texas, as you look at this, we're seeing the western portion, Trans-Pecos area, is up to extreme or exceptional drought in areas. And then if you look again on the northern portion between Texas and Oklahoma border, we're seeing some drought in that area. And we have some abnormally dry areas all scattered throughout the state. So, if we aren't thinking about a drought management plan, we probably should. And then hopefully some of these people that already are in these drought conditions, they've implemented that drought management plan to help preserve their forage resources out there on the land. Some things to consider when we're talking about a drought management plan, and this goes back to tying back into your grazing plan like Jason just covered, but we got to know what we have when we're talking about drought. What resources are available out there? How many livestock do we have? How large are the livestock? What breeding cycle is that livestock in? All of that will help us determine how to implement a drought management plan. what is the water quantity and quality on your operation? Do we have enough water to get us through droughts? Sometimes if we're relying on surface water, we might run out of surface water before we run out of forage. Or do we see a decrease in quality of that livestock water as droughts occur out there? One thing to kind of think about when we're talking about water quantity and quality is if you do have a pasture that is based on surface water, or maybe a well goes dry soon before others, maybe we need to think about grazing those pastures earlier in the year before that drought occurs, knowing that there is a probability that they could run out of water. How much forage do we have? And is it good quality forage? Oftentimes we'll see it in drought conditions that forage quality goes down. But we need to know what's out there whenever we're determining that stocking rate or if we need to destock those livestock. Do we have issues with toxic plants in areas? Oftentimes that's when we see some plant toxicity issues in livestock is during a drought. And that typically occurs because they don't have anything else to eat. So do we have some pastures that do grow toxic plants and others don't? And if so, maybe we need to try to get in those pastures before the drought occurs. Or maybe that we know all pastures have them and we just have to defer completely, or anything else that might affect the system. So that could be, supplemental feeding or something along those lines. Another thing that I like to include in a drought plan is your trigger dates and what are you going to do when you hit those trigger dates. And I'll go a little more in depth in these, but this could be based on rainfall or forage production. How much should we receive at certain times a year? And if we don't receive those, what are we going to do? The biggest thing I'm going to try to cover today is practice conservative stocking rates. A lot of times, we can prevent that drought stress from occurring if we're stocked conservatively before it occurs. A monitoring plan. How are we going to determine if we're in a drought or if we need to reduce livestock numbers or rotate cattle? And this should account for both forage growth and recovery. And once that drought does occur, because it's going to happen, unfortunately, what are we going to do to try to protect those forage resources? So on trigger dates, what I typically like to use, this is off of Ecological Site Description, which is off of, it's a public website. Anybody can access it for your property. It's www.edit.jornada.nmsu.edu. But if you just type in Ecological Site Descriptions or edit ESDs, it should pull up and you can map out your property. But what we're looking at here on this ecological site description is the monthly precipitation for that that's typical for that ecological site on your property. And when we choose this ecological site that we're going to evaluate, typically we want to choose the most prominent one or the best forage producing one to help make those decisions, because likely you're going to have multiple ecological site descriptions scattered throughout your property. So the most dominant one is typically what I like to use. But if you notice here, the rainfall, and this is out of San Angelo, a clay loam ecological site, but the rainfall for this site, typically we get a flush of rain in May or June, and then the summer lull or starts getting kind of dry, and then another push of rain in the fall. Now, this is typically, it doesn't always occur this way, but when we set these trigger dates, we need to kind of know how much rain we should be received because it relates to forage growth. And so I like to set these trigger dates based off of quarters. So whether it's 25%, 50%, 75%, whatever it might be, and then monitor that rainfall to determine if we've met that. So if you'll notice here and this is rainfall from November 1st. But if you notice here for this site, we should receive about 50% of precipitation by the middle of May. And so if we don't receive that 50% of precipitation, what are we going to do with our livestock numbers to help protect that resource and implement that drought management plan? And then again, we should see if, say we did receive 50% of that rainfall by the middle of May, but it continues dry through the summer, and we don't reach 75% of our rainfall average by, say, August 1st, then we might implement that drought plan then. Another thing available on these ecological sites are ecological site description growth curves. And this is the amount of forage that is produced throughout the year. One thing I want you to notice is this line graph follows a lot like the rainfall patterns, which is expected, right? When we're talking about growing forage, we need rainfall to make that occur. But we see a big flush of growth in the late spring, early summer. Then it kind of doesn't grow a whole lot in the summertime, and then late summer, early fall, we'll see another flush of growth in this area that this ecological site was taken from. And so one thing I want you to notice is the rainfall that we just looked at, it was about the middle of May when we received about 50%. And this is about June 1st is by the time we should expect 50% of forage growth, which is very similar to the rainfall curve that we just looked at. And then again, August, middle of August is when we should have 75% of forage growth. So what we use this for is to say, okay, if we're expecting 1,000 pounds of forage growth to occur on this property, and we don't have 500 pounds or 50% of it by June, then we are probably entering a drought, and we need to do something with our livestock numbers. And the same thing for the 75%. Another thing I like to look at when I'm talking about drought management is what is our annual precipitation, because we need to know what that average annual precipitation is if we're going to say we need 50% by May 15th or 75% by August 1st. And so I pulled this off of weather.gov. This is for San Angelo. And if you notice here, the average annual precipitation was about 24 inches. This is 50 years of data. And so earlier I talked about stocking conservatively. So let's say that we stock at carrying capacity, or what that property can support on a normal year, whatever that might be. If we were to stock at that, then we'd be stocking for that 24-inch rainfall pattern. And if you look at this over the last 50 years, you'll see that approximately 20 of the past 50 years have been above average rainfall. So 20 of those past 50 years, we would have been stocked correctly, which is about 40% of the time. But 30 of those past 50 years, we would have been overstocked, or 60% of the time. So I think if we're stocking at that 100% carrying capacity, oftentimes when the drought does hit, it's going to hit that producer that is stocked at that maximum carrying capacity a lot harder than someone that might be stocked conservatively. They won't have as much time to implement that drought management plan as someone that's stocked conservatively, which could injure the forage resources a lot quicker. And so what I like to do is I like to break that down and say, okay, well, if I was stocked conservatively, let's say 75% of carrying capacity of the property, that would bring my rainfall that I need down to 18 inches. So it dropped at about 6 inches from the 100%. And then I start looking at this, and I see that approximately 44 of the past 50 years have been above 75% average rainfall, or 88% of the time. So that would just mean that 6 out of the past 50 years, I might be overstocked. And that's okay. It's going to happen. We have to be flexible when we're talking about these stocking rates. But if it's only 6 out of the past 50 years, then likely I'm going to have forage carryover from the previous years. That's going to help get me through that drought. Or I might still have to reduce stocking rate, but it's not going to be as harsh on me as a producer as someone that might be overstocked. Now, in these years, a lot of time we see these years that are way above that 75% stocking rate or 75% average rainfall, and that's fine too. We can use that forage to help capture more rainfall, put roots in the soil, build up that soil health. Or if we wanted to, we keep flexibility in our grazing plan, and we might be able to introduce other livestock like stockers, or maybe buying some bred heifers or something like that to help make that extra forage count. Another thing I like to look at, this is also available to anybody. This is a rangeland analysis platform. This is a property that I drew off just south of San Angelo. And what this is a forage production over the past 37 years for this property. And it uses satellite imagery to help predict that forage production. But one thing I like to make note of, if you look at this forage production, it's all over the place. It's not a gentle straight line on this property. It changes from year to year, and sometimes it changes drastically for the good or the bad. So our stocking rate needs to be flexible to help account for that different amount of forage production. And so if you see that gray line right there in the middle, that is the 100% or the average production for this property. And if we were to stock for that 100% production, 17 of the past 37 years have been above 100% production, which means 45% of the time we did our job correctly as land managers. But 55% of the time we were overstocked, or about once every 2 years we could be potentially overstocked, which is very similar to the rainfall data that I just showed you in two slides before this. But if we look at that yellow line, that's the 75% of production. If we were to stock for that 75% production, then 32 of the past 37 years, we would have been stocked correctly, or 86% of the time, which is very similar to the 88% that showed us on the rainfall. So that rainfall is very important to drive that forage growth, and we can use that data to help make our drought management plans. Some of the monitoring plans or tools that we can use are the rainfall records. That way we know if we're hitting those trigger dates, like I mentioned from the ecological site description. And as you keep rainfall records over time, you're going to know about what your average annual precipitation is. Grazing records, what are we doing out there? How many livestock do we have? What pasture were they in at what time? What breeding cycle were they in? And that way we can go back on those if we need to make some changes to the plan based on drought. Jason showed you the slide here, but the utilization percentage or stubble heights of key forage species, how low are we grazing that grass? Are we leaving enough forage out there if the drought does occur that we're not going to lose that grass due to a dry climate? If we're leaving 50% out there, we should have deep enough roots to allow that forage to recover quickly. One thing a lot of people say is that the last people in a drought are typically the first ones out, and that bases off of the amount of forage that is available. Grazing exposure, a great tool to know how much forage we've grown out there. That'll help us determine what percent forage based like on the growth curve that I showed you from the ecological site. And this can be constructed with T-posts and welded wire, make a 4x4, 4 foot by 4 foot area, keep the livestock off of it. Within there, we'll know what was grown for the year. On the outside, we can tell what they're grazing. And photo points are an excellent tool as well. Those photo points should be taken from the same place, the same time each year, facing the same direction. And over years, as we're doing those photo points, we'll be able to see the effects of drought or what we did that worked. And the more data you have, the better it is. So let's say that we are following those trigger points. We're monitoring, we're looking at everything, and drought does occur. What are some tools that you can use to help you keep the resources available out on your property? One thing is, maybe some pastures they're grazing one side of it a little harder than the other, or maybe they're not grazing it and the grazing distribution is poor. Maybe we can adjust water and or feeding locations to help pull those livestock over there or remove the livestock from an area. That way we can utilize that forage that's available when we're in a drought. We can wean calves early. This is going to remove some of that stress from the mom while they're lactating. It's going to reduce the consumption of that mom, and that way the number of livestock we have aren't consuming much forage because we aren't growing as much since we are in a drought. Oftentimes we're going to have to reduce stocking rates, and we need to have a plan in place to do that. A lot of herds, they might have a bottom 10% that we're willing to get rid of. And it could be dry open females, maybe some older livestock, some livestock that's hard to handle or has some slow growing calves or ewes or whatever type of livestock you're running out there. One thing I kind of like to refer this to is the 3 O's, the old, open, or ornery cows are the first ones that we're going to get rid of when we hit those trigger points and we're entering into a drought or currently in one. And unfortunately, the persistent severe drought may require the property to be completely destocked. A lot of the areas that I work with out here in West Texas, they destocked completely last year because they were too dry. They haven't grown any forage. And it's a good thing they did because they're still dry and they still haven't grown any forage. But the forage that's out there is still able to produce and capture that rainfall when it does rain. And then, as always, the best drought management strategy is preparation. If you have a plan in place, then you really need to, it helps you to implement a lot better. When the rain resumes, allow the forage to fully recover. Make sure that the roots are deep and the forage is healthy. We can evaluate infrastructure, whether it's water gaps, livestock water, fences. Evaluate your current plan. What needed to be changed or what can we do differently to make that plan better? Restock slowly, because remember that forage is still stressed coming out of a drought. It takes some time to recover, and then implement a grazing management plan. Thank y'all for letting me present.
You did great, Sawyer. Thank you so much.
All right, next up, we have Camille Carey to speak on managing soil ecosystems, how soil arthropods and microbes drive soil resilience. Camille is a PhD student at Texas A&M University in the Rangeland Wildlife and Fisheries Department, working under Dr. Doug Tollison. Her research focuses on how rangeland disturbances affect soil arthropods and their roles in the soil food web and ecosystem. Camille holds a master's degree in entomology from Oklahoma State University, a bachelor's degree in horticulture from Tarleton University, and an associate degree from Weatherford College. She has a deep appreciation for the role of producers in land management and is dedicated to applying her research to support practical, sustainable practices that benefit both ecosystems and the land managers who work with them. Camille, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you guys so much. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about managing soil ecosystems, how soil arthropods and microbes drive soil resilience. So some things to first talk to you guys about. I'm going to give you guys a broad overview of soil ecosystems. It is very complex. There are many different cycles and just general processes within soil. So I'll try my best to answer as many questions and be informational while not being bogged down by very scientific processes. So the things that we'll be talking about today is soil health and soil ecosystem resilience under a arthropod and microbe lens. The roles of those two in soils and the importance of soil microbes and some management practices for y'all. And so these are just kind of some pictures of some soil, you could argue soil, there we go, some soil arthropods. This is a carrion beetle. These are some nematodes, and this is actually one of our Texas dung beetles. So soil health and ecosystem resilience. So like I said, we'll be talking about these two topics under the arthropod and microbe lens. So soil health, to entomologists and to the soil ecosystem, is just the capability of the soil to continuing functioning as a living organism that supports plants, animals, and humans. And I think that's a very good definition because soil absolutely does help support humans, and we'll talk about that later. Soil resilience, on the other hand, is just the soil's ability to recover to its stable state and after a disturbance. And kind of the reason why that is in parentheses is because stable state isn't always the soil's natural state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, though. But key components of this, how do we know it's a stable state? How do we know what soil health is? That's just kind of based off of soil structure, the biodiversity, soil, nutrient cycling, and water rotation. So why does this matter? Why am I talking to y'all today? Why do we even have 15 minutes where we have to talk about this? Well, soil is one of the main drivers for a lot of our above ground ecosystem functions. A lot of things that we need, even arguable oxygen that we breathe in. A lot of the key components that happen are decomposition, nitrogen cycling, even biological pests. So fluke worms, if you have cattle and you're having problems with that, microbes are a really big component to that fluke worm life cycle, carbon cycling, and water availability. If we all like drinking water, then we like soil ecosystems. So what I'm going to be talking to y'all about today, I tried to add microbes to this, but this is just kind of something to get you guys kind of thinking, other than dung beetles, how many other different organisms are actually in the soil. So first up, what we're going to talk about is arthropods. How do they help with soil health? How do they help with soil resilience? So they're decomposers, first off. They absolutely break down a lot of unavailable nutrients, especially dung beetles that take a lot of unavailable matter that either the cow, the sheep, whatever livestock you have out there has consumed and has either laid a patty for. They take a lot of those nutrients, convert it in a very particular way, scientific way, and basically reinvent the energy again and put it back into the system that either our plants or might go through another different various other channels. It might be released in gases that our plants, us, whatever we need to breathe in. And so there's a lot of different key takeaways for that. They also help with soil water rotation. And the reason why for that is a lot of soil pores, and the aeration of soil can either hold a lot of water or have the availability for water to pass more freely into the soil, not run off for erosion and fill up our water tables. Another key one that I want us to talk about is actually really two, is they are also very big deterrents for pests and parasites. So if we're dealing with armyworms, fluke worms, we can even go and say eye worms for the quail, some other various pests. Our soil arthropods and microbes are really big components to that. And things like herbicides and pesticides and even just general other disturbances we'll talk about later can affect that. And it's something to keep something to think about when writing a managed practice. And so they also recently, with a couple of papers that were published, they can actually be natural deterrents to exotic plant invasion. So what that means is kind of like talking in our previous presentation about drought and how drought can affect root biomass. Well, and sometimes that might make plant communities more susceptible to exotic plant invasion. Sometimes arthropods, especially within these two channels here, that they might condition the plants, or they sometimes actually will harbor or bring in water from other areas into that soil. So it might be dry all around these plants, but this particular plant where their root system has a great deal of water because of these soil, we call them ecosystem engineers. So ultimately, what I want you to take away is that they're the hardest worker for you, but you can't see them. So soil microbes. And once again, I kind of left these pictures if you guys want to take a picture of them. This is incredibly complex, but I did want to present it to people in case they wanted to come back and look at it, or if someone wanted to have more scientific processes of soil microbes. So what are they? If no one knows, they can be bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. There's so many others. And a lot of the things that they do actually only take place within the first feet, depending on where you are. If you're out in Sonora in West Texas, it's a couple of first inches. But if you're up in like North Texas, we're probably talking about the first couple of, maybe about a foot. And that's normally where they are. That's based off a soil nutrient gradient. And what they normally do, the reason why I say normally, they're normally huge food sources for a lot of the soil biota, and they are complex drivers of the nutrient system. So we can kind of see some here, and on the next page, we'll talk about the nitrogen cycle a little bit. They also, unfortunately, can be another potential, I guess I don't want to say the word vector, but they can be potential for pathogenic diseases. So nematodes, as we know, bacterial, fungi, think about oak wilt, and some other things that they can potentially be harmful for the ecosystem. But there is a strong evidence, though, that some of these soil microbes can actually mediate plant diversity. And the reason why that's important to say is that if you're trying to reseed a place out, maybe that was reseeded to Canada or Canada rye, and you're having issues, maybe reseeding it somewhere else, it might be reasonable to try to go take some soil tests to evaluate what kind of soil microbes are there. Are they conditioning the seeds? Are they conditioning the seed bank to their liking? And they also are safeguards against heavy metal leaching. And so this is kind of more of a very technical, just to kind of get you guys thinking, okay, so this is a molecule. This is nitrogen, the molecule, which is kind of unavailable, can't really be used in the food web unless it goes through some of these processes. So this is, a tree. There's some soil microbes. There's also going to be soil arthropods in here, but this doesn't show that. And this just kind of shows that a lot of these organisms and volatiles, which we'll talk about a little bit, are major components of our ecosystems, and we absolutely need to have them. So, like I've been trying to say, why should we all care? Why is this important? You guys can't see them. They're kind of hard to test for if you're out in the field. I understand that, but the why you should care is because they're absolutely critical for a lot of our functions, ecosystem functions. We know that a lot of our management practices affect them, but we just don't really know how yet. And if we want to have better stocking rates, more biomass productions, more resilience to drought, they are all soil mediated processes. A lot of times we think that they are above ground processes, that maybe it's a different grazing plan, maybe it's a different management plan, maybe it's more irrigation. While those may be true, a lot of times it might just be an issue underground or something that's going below ground, like in this picture here, that might be more mediated. So this is just kind of showing right here is that the actual soil pores and soil structures is a key driver in how nutrients are done through a gradient. So if you are fertilizing, have you ever wondered, how does my fertilizer find my plants, or how does my roots take them? This is kind of a really good picture if you guys want to take a picture of it. So another thing that I really want to say real quickly is that there are a lot of papers that do say that while above ground disturbances affect soil functions, and those soil processes might not be to our liking, the only way for us to really, what is hypothesized to fix those processes, if we need to have more water, if we need to have less fluke worms, is to do some more targeted approaches below ground. And that's what kind of makes that a little hard. And so management practices. So what are some management practices? So I've told you what soil arthropods are. I told you what soil microbes are. We kind of know what soil resilience and health is underneath these lenses. But how, as a producer or as an NRC agent talking to a producer, or even a land manager just trying to write a plan, how does that mean to us? How can you implicate these things that you can't even see? I'm sad to say that right now there is no real easy way to test for soil microbes, and it's very sad. There are professors, Dr. Tolson is one of them, that is looking at maybe there might be potentially later on down the road with technology, there might be a way for you just to take a picture of your phone to see. But at this option, at this time, there's really no great way. So physical identification of the larger organisms in the soil. So physical identification of arthropods like dung beetles, millipedes, or pseudoscorpions, which are predators, are another pretty good way to know if you have a healthy, balanced ecosystem. It still would probably be beneficial for you to take that one soil core and send it to a soil lab just to do some testing. And as an entomologist, I do feel like I have to say that the published literature does not support using earthworms as a viable indicator of soil health. I'm sorry, I had to say it. To help support dung beetle populations, another really good, if you guys need some tips, to use herbicides and pesticides at off times of the year. The reason why is because that's based off of their life cycles. I would say probably later in the spring or later in the fall if you're out in West Texas, just because those are what those species are. And then also the time of day is critically important, because a lot of dung beetles might be super active in the morning, but not active at high noon. Some of them are active at high noon. And if you're going out there spraying or worming your cattle or sheep, you're just or herbicides, you're kind of hurting your hardest worker. And so if you are going to use chemicals, which I know a lot of us have to, there's nothing wrong with it if in a management style is to avoid the open or softer soils. And the reason why is because those are a lot of the places that the organism, the dung beetles, are laying their larvae. And so when you're thinking of a grazing plan, I think one of the important things is to just evaluate what you have, and then also just, try your best. At the end of the day, we're all humans that are just trying to make this world a better place. And I think the more information that is out there, the better. So thank y'all.
Thanks for that great presentation, Camille. That was really good. And moving on to our next presentation. Next up, we have Dr. Doug Tollison to speak with us about what we can learn from the soil plant animal nexus to help inform rangeland management decisions. So Dr. Tollison is the chief scientist at the Texas A&M AgriLife Research Station in Sonora, Texas. He's also director of the Grazing Land Animal Nutrition Laboratory and co-director of the Center for Natural Resource Information Technology. His research focuses on advancing the knowledge of grazing animal nutrition and physiology via expanding the application of near-infrared spectroscopy, as well as contributing to the practical applications of rangeland vegetation and soil monitoring to inform landscape-scale biophysical models and early warning systems for drought, grazing, or wildfires. This research is taken into various locations across the U.S., as well as to Africa, Asia, and South America. Welcome to the Plant Party, Dr. Tollison. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Glad to be here, and good job on saying near-infrared reflectance spectroscopy.
Appreciate that.
I tell you, Jason, Sawyer, and Camille have really set the stage for me very well. It's almost like we planned it this way, Megan. So really want to take my hat off to them and appreciate what they've done to kind of set this topic up. As I was listening to the walk-up music here, as we were all getting ready for this, I was inspired by the first song, and it just really went well with what I had set up originally to talk about, putting this plant, soil, animal nexus together. And I was going to use state symbols to make these points, and so it worked out really well. So Houston Black is our state soil of Texas, which I'm sure most of you were aware of. And again, as we've heard so wonderfully just before us, the soil is where all of this starts and ends, and I'll bring that in another slide. This obviously then would interact what the soil quality, and how it's distributed would interact with how our plants are able to grow, will dictate what range sites, ecological sites we have, that combination of soils and vegetation. And this happens to be our state grass of Texas. And one of my favorites, which you will notice if you're looking and paying close attention as we go through these slides, I'm really a fan of Cytops grama. And then I really appreciate the importance that the livestock industry has had in not only the current lifestyle, economy, culture of the state of Texas, but also as we go back into our history. It has been part of our history from the beginning. And even if we go back to European expansion across the states, wild animals, large ungulates, bison, elk, deer, as well as some of our smaller animals. And then again, those that we don't often appreciate as much, those that are underneath the ground, have been a part of this together. So that soil, plant, animal nexus is what we're going to talk about, and specifically with respect to the animals, not only what they're grazing and taking off of the land, but what they're also putting back onto the land. And it kind of completes that cycle. So this is a conceptual model that I've kind of put together that expands on the concept that probably we've all heard a lot about of the plant-animal interface, where grazing, where herbivory takes place. And I've kind of taken that based on some other literature and mentors that I've had, and kind of taken it from a molecule to an ecosystem scale, and looked back and forth across that animal, and not just the plant, but the entire environment, the ecosystem that plant and that animal exist in. So the point here is that something as simple as what plant does an animal take, or what part of a plant does an animal take for a meal, and how that is incorporated into their body, their metabolism, can actually cross back and forth across this interface here, and again, scale up and down through an entire animal, through an entire pasture, range site, region. And so all of these things are connected. So things that an animal does behaviorally to select a certain plant or plant part, again, will have effects on that animal all the way down to molecules within their cells, organelles, how they are metabolizing and using those nutrients. And that can scale up to how that animal is healthy or not, which then it becomes an aggregate part of a herd and that sort of thing. So I think you can kind of see the concept there of how a lot of these topics are going to tie together. So again, everyone has made this point, and I'm going to reiterate it and follow along with Camille's lead, that all of our agricultural natural resource stewardship, all of our management really begins and ends with soil. It's easy to see how it begins. I'm going to kind of bring back in a little bit as we go through here, again, talking about the animals and what they do on the landscape, how it also ends, or actually more correctly to say how it completes that cycle. This is a very typical type of a graphic that we would see with some principles of soil health. Sometimes you will see them that will have more or less factors. Some of these words here I might change from minimize or maximize to optimize, because sometimes depending on what our goals may be for the type of stewardship we're looking for, the type of animal or wildlife product that we're trying to accomplish, maximizing one or the other may not be the right thing to do for a particular goal. So optimizing, I think, is a better word for this. I'm going to focus a little bit as we start here on the soil and just pick out soil organic matter, where the carbon is, where all of the other nutrients are that the plants and the animals are putting into the soil, that the microbes and the macroorganisms that we heard about are making those available, interacting with those plant roots, and putting those into an inorganic state so that the plants can then take them in and use them. And we see that point that has been well made. We may have 2,000 pounds of acre per acre of biomass from an NRCS graphic here. We may then have close to 10,000 pounds per acre of biomass below ground in the soil. That's an important topic to be discussed now, as soil carbon sequestration is becoming a hotter issue. And we have, as agricultural and natural resource managers, known and used this concept for years. Now it may be something that can be marketed, and it can become more of our management strategy to try to include that in one of the products in our ecosystem goods and services, along with food and fiber or recreation. And you can see that there are different fractions of organic matter there, some that last for weeks to months, some that are decades long, and some that are more longer lasting than that, more permanent. One of the things that I want to talk about then as we start looking at this interaction between soil and plants and animals is this concept of litter. And not litter as we're throwing trash out the window of our car as we go down the highway, but litter in terms of plant material that dies, decays, is trampled, windblown, becomes then separated from the plant, ends up on the surface of the soil. So you can see in this plant here on the left that it's been grazed and it's been used at probably close to that 50% utilization. You might argue with me a little bit on that, but remember that it's not the height of the plant that we're interested in, it's the mass. So I would say that probably on this particular plant that we're probably in that 50 to maybe 60% utilization on this particular plant. There's still a fair bit of leaf area index there. Plants that are photosynthesizing, doing what plants do and putting roots into the ground. But you can see that there's a lot of litter around this plant. This plant happens to have been under a canopy that had been removed, a brush canopy, but it's also, you can see that some of that litter there is grass leaves that have been placed on the ground as well. Contrast that with our plant on the right, plant that's maybe a little later in the phenological stage, maybe in the fall, this time of year, maybe going forward, as where I sit in Southwest Texas, still a little bit of green leaf in there, but we can see some seed heads, we can see some culms. This plant has gone reproductive. But as we look down in the rocks and the soil there, we can see that there's some litter from that plant on the ground as well. The point I want to make here is that not only the quantity of litter, the amount of material that comes back and gets in contact with that soil, intercepts raindrops, breaks that up, helps control erosion, the quality of that litter is going to be important for those soil micros and macros that we learned about, as that becomes food for them and enters the soil and becomes part of their life cycle as well. So quantity and quality are both going to be important. And then this brings us to a slide that many of us have seen before. It comes right out of a classic grazing ecology management book that was put out by the Range Department at A&M close to 30 years ago now. And this is a slide that we could teach an entire graduate range class on, and it's how do we manage the amount of animals on a particular given area, and this could be livestock or wildlife. We can see that in the yellow line, as we add more animals to a given site, their performance at their genetic optimum starts to decline as we add more animals and they start to compete for forage. On the blue line, we see that the production per unit area starts low with few animals, also reaches a peak and then drops off as that production per animal drops off dramatically. So our management then, our stewardship needs to occur at that magic point there where those two lines cross. That can be a little easier done when we are talking about a monoculture, some of the things that Jason talked about earlier. But he made the point that as we get into some of these more ranged, more diverse type of sites, we can have a lot of different plants that are growing at different times of the year, responding to precipitation at different phenological stages. And so we sort of have that shifting mosaic happening across our landscape in time and space, which can be a great thing, can also complicate our management and our decision making. So we kind of have to be up to that challenge. Forage quantity, pretty easy to measure. We put a hoop, a square on the ground, we clip it, we dry it, we do the biomass, do the math to scale it up. Forage quality then, as we're looking at protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals, a little bit harder to measure. And it all relates back to our freshman biology and the structure of a cell. The cell wall, which is made out of the cellulose and those lignin, those non-digestible type components, not digestible to us, but are digestible to microbes, specifically the ones in a ruminant stomach. And the ratio of those to the inner part of the cell, the proteins, the fats, the different things that are stored there, that is going to determine the quality. Selection of animals is going to be dictated by quantity and quality. Herbivores typically are going to try to select new versus old, live versus dead, and leaf versus stem. And you can see that that has happened in this photo here, again, of our side oats. There had been some selection by a grazing animal to pick the parts of the plant that they wanted. Now, as we start to then scale up, think about that first conceptual diagram, going from an individual animal choosing a leaf to consume, all the way up to an ecosystem, to a regional, national scale. This is our most current recent NDVI satellite imagery of greenness. Corresponds pretty well to that drought map that we saw from Sawyer. Here's another way of looking at it that I think probably may be a little more applicable to us. So this is Citizen Science National Phenology Network, that people go out and measure when they start to see plants green up, leaves emerge, flowers, pollination, seed drop, that sort of thing. So across the nation, this is a depiction of when did spring occur this year. So the more purple or blue would be earlier relative to historic norms. The darker green, light to dark green would be, purple would be late, green would be early. We make that distinction. So we're almost always going to have a mixed bag. And you look over in the west, a lot of that is determined by elevation, but remember that it's relative to the historical norm for that site. So again, the west was fairly early, the Midwest and the east was fairly late. Midwest, east, fairly early this year. And then this is last year. So last year, spring was late for much of the US and kind of normal to a little early for a lot of the rest. So things are changing all the time with respect to the plant phenology and what those plants then are providing in quality and quantity to the animals based on the soils that they're on. All of this has to be done in a way that we're meeting the nutritional requirements of those animals. They have to maintain themselves, reproduce, lactate, which for mammals, this is the biggest drain on their nutritional requirements for the year. They have to grow, and in some places, parts of the world, they also have to work. And then, of course, some of our animals are producing fiber. All of this then will result in what I like to refer to as our Goldilocks cow. This cow's not too thin. She's not too fat. She's just right. And we know she is a reflection of the fact that nutrition leads to body condition, which is then going to lead to performance. Because you can find a graph like this from pretty much every extension department in the US and in different places around the world. The better condition our animals are in, the more likely they are to reproduce for us and be productive. So let's put all this together. Let's start to bring this nexus into play. When we have plants growing on a particular soil that are in high or low nutrient quality and quantity, you can see the differences in the phenology of these two side oats on the left. We're going to end up with animals that are in different nutritional states and will have a different body condition. And they will then be producing fecal material, different consistency and quality, at least drier, but also differences in the nutrients in them. And you'll see that difference in the top picture versus the lower. This is what is being deposited back on the ground, as well as being an indicator of the nutritional status of that animal. We have done some research to look at this across the US, 25,000 fecal samples that have been analyzed by the Graceland Animal Nutrition Lab to predict the diet, protein, and digestibility. And lo and behold, across the US, hot, dry climates end up with lower diet quality. Cool, wet climates end up with higher diet quality. And we can look at this even on an individual ranch basis. So this is a ranch in Ozona where we looked at body condition and took fecal samples once a month for about 1.5 years. And you can see that we followed. The red line is the predicted and the blue line is the observed. That's the observed body condition that changed through those animals, and we're able to monitor that pretty closely. And again, all of this comes back to what Sawyer told us. It all comes down to rain and what is falling on our soils. And the point here from this 100 years worth of data at Sonora is that we're starting to get more variable again, just like we were before the big drought of the 1950s. So what can we learn from all that is that soil matters, feeds our plants feed our animals feed us, and they in turn get back around, feed the soil to complete that cycle. So
that was great, Dr. Tollefson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, we are ready to get going on our last presentation. Our final speaker is Billy Lambert, who has been with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Billy has been in his current role as a senior biologist and assistant district leader in District 6 since 2021. Prior to that, he served as both a biologist and then a private lands biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife in the Brazos Valley and College Station area since his start. He received a bachelor's degree from Texas Tech University and a master's with Texas Tech in collaboration with the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. I'll turn it over to you, Billy, to speak on using habitat parameters to guide deer management decisions.
All right, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and we're going to talk about habitat parameters to guide deer management decisions. Now, deer management, just about everything in deer management falls under three major factors. And some of you may have heard the three-legged stool approach. First is age. And that's important because body size and antler size are not maximized until mature age classes. And of course, that's what most folks are managing for, is larger bodies, larger antler sizes. But also age structure also comes into play for females because that can influence recruitment and population dynamics, meaning that older age class does typically produce more fawns, and those fawns survive better because they're better mothers. And the opposite is true for juvenile deer. So population dynamics comes into play with the females. Now you move into nutrition. As you might imagine, nutrition affects every aspect of a deer's life: growth rates, antler growth, reproduction, disease and parasite resistance. All of those things come into play with nutrition, so it's very important. And then lastly, you move into genetics, and that's kind of the genetic makeup sets the kind of the upper bar. And then, their final body size, antler size, and other physical features are then also governed by age and nutrition. So those are the three common things you hear about in deer management, but you'll notice nowhere in that three-legged stool approach does it talk about the habitat. And there might be a couple of reasons for that. First is deer are extremely adaptable. They're found all the way from northern Canada all the way down to South America and every habitat in between, even the mountainous and desert environments. So deer are very adaptable, and there's not a specific habitat requirement that you would apply to deer. Another thing is going back into probably the 80s and 90s, folks figured out that it's entirely possible to grow deer in the absence of habitat. You don't need habitat. You need a fence to keep them from going anywhere, and you need a bag of feed, and you can grow deer. So again, there's just no specific habitat requirements for deer. But for most people and for most properties, the concepts of a land ethic and land stewardship, plus the realization that deer are just one component of an overall ecosystem approach, where everything is very intricate and interrelated, and one thing affects another thing, and all things affect other things. Given all of that, that kind of dictates that you need to consider the habitat when you're talking about deer. But it's still okay to be a deer guy. That's where I've been most of my career, is even though I understand, well, I think I understand all the intricacies of ecosystem dynamics, my focus has always been deer, and that's okay. And so given that, in this approach, maybe that three-legged stool, maybe we should approach it more as a four-legged stool, where we also throw in a habitat component. And the habitat, of course, there's things that the habitat can tell you to reveal important information relative to your management efforts and how successful your deer herd is. Now, when you talk about habitat, we're always talking about food, space, water, and cover. And that's true for all wildlife species, not just for deer. We're going to ignore space and water because the mean people that organized this thing only gave me 15 minutes. So we're going to ignore the space and the water part and just talk about food and cover. Now, cover, there are some very detailed habitat analysis techniques that you can use to evaluate that. But usually it's good enough to do just simple windshield time. Look at your property. Just drive around and evaluate your habitat visually. Every biologist in the state, when we go look at properties, usually we can evaluate the major problems with a property within the first 3, 4, 5 minutes that we're on site. So just a visual inspection is usually adequate to at least determine some of the things that might be limiting. These are the major cover type or cover aspects that when you're talking about deer. Thermal cover in Texas pretty much means shade. That's not necessarily true maybe in northern environments where you might have snow cover. You might have extended periods of really cold weather. But in Texas, thermal cover pretty much just means finding some shade to get out of the heat. Screening cover is important. Hiding cover, escape cover, it has different names. Usually we're talking about woody vegetation. That's usually not limiting anywhere in Texas. Every ecoregion in Texas has problems with brush encroachment. So screening cover is usually not an issue. But even grass cover, if you get into some of the prairie habitats or some of the tall grass habitats, even grass sometimes that's tall enough can serve as screening cover. Bedding cover, oops, not advancing the slide, sorry about that. Bedding cover is not really all that important. Deer are going to find a place to sleep somewhere. But fawning cover is the big one. This one's really important because fawning cover is the major limiting factor that affects recruitment anywhere you are in the state. Doesn't matter where you are. The number of fawns that successfully get recruited in the deer herd is largely due to fawning cover. Now, predators typically get the blame for a lot of that, but it's not so much a predator issue because good habitat is what allows the fawns to hide from the predators. So it kind of mitigates the negative effects of the predation. So if you're seeing low fawn crops, typically that's more of a fawning cover problem than a predator problem. The two pictures on the left, if that's the best cover that you have to hide a fawn, you're going to have some problems because it's going to be a lot easier for predators to find those deer. Plus there's exposure issues, temperature issues. So the photo on the right is really what you're looking for in terms of ideal fawning cover. The first few months of a deer's life, their whole goal in life is to hide, is to not be seen. And you need to have that sort of habitat to hide those fawns so that they can successfully move into older age classes. Now, again, cover is not usually limiting over most of Texas, but all biologists will get a call that, hey, we'd like to have more deer. Why don't we have more deer? And if you drive through the gate and see something like this, that's a pretty good explanation. You don't need a lot of detailed habitat analysis to know that there's no cover on this property. There's no residual grass cover. Nutrition is limiting. There's no fawning cover. There's no screening cover, no hiding cover. cover, you're really not supposed to be able to see cow pies 150, 200 yards away. So these are all major habitat issues, but most properties aren't to this extreme. Now, the other aspect when you start talking about habitat quality is nutrition, and that is very important. And there was a time, going back 70s and 80s, there was a time when animal condition was highly correlated with habitat quality. So if you had large deer, good. Not that some things might not be lacking, but overall the habitat quality is pretty good. But it's not really that way anymore. Habitat management is very expensive. It's time consuming. It's labor intensive. And folks kind of figured out that, well, we don't need to go to all that trouble. We'll just put out more feed. And while you can do that, that's just a Band-Aid approach. And ultimately it causes more problems in the long run, in that now you're sustaining and you're carrying more deer on your habitat than you should, which adds to the habitat pressure. Plus it's very expensive. And now the deer are dependent on you to feed them. And that's a bad situation and a place that you don't want to be. So once you move away from places that are heavily fed, deer health and deer herd health are reflected in the habitat quality. So that could be a good index as to what sort of habitat quality you have. And because of that, there are several methods to quantify habitat condition. And that brings up vegetation sampling, which is a horrible, nasty, dirty, filthy word. And I apologize to any kids that might be watching. It's a nightmare for every graduate student, wildlife student that's ever graduated. So if you find anybody that says they like vegetation sampling, you might ought to move away from them, because they're probably psychotic and you don't want anything to do with them. So that there are some very detailed ways that you can analyze the habitat, but really for the most part, you can do some relatively simple evaluations that will give you an index as to how good your habitat quality is, which in turn affects the nutrition available to the deer herd. Browse surveys are a big one. And all a browse survey is a way to quantify the percentage or the number of stems that have been browsed by deer. And you do that by species. And high browse utilization usually means high deer densities. And at high deer densities, that's when you become concerned with nutrition available to that deer herd. But there are some problems with it. In areas that have livestock, browse surveys are frequently complicated by livestock, especially sheep and goats, which can be heavy browsers at times, depending on other forage availability. But even things like cows, livestock or cattle grazing, where you typically think of cows as just eating grass. Well, they will, and when forage availability is limited, they will switch to browse where they're competing with deer. So even cows can come into play and complicate the results of a browse analysis. Another problem with browse surveys is that preference is always a function of availability, meaning a plant that might be heavily used on one property may not be used at all on a different property, because it all depends on what vegetation they have available to them. So a browse survey always needs to be done in conjunction with a knowledge of what browse species you have on your property. When you do a browse survey, typically you have different rankings. You have highly preferred plants, mediocre plants, and plants that you hope deer aren't eating. And it's usually a good idea to concentrate your browse survey analysis on the not preferred plants, the undesirable plants, because if you see high utilization on those plants, then you know the deer are forced to eat them because they don't want to be eating those, and it means you probably have some fairly significant nutritional problems on the property. Another problem you have is that bite marks aren't always easily identifiable on some species. Like greenbrier is a good example. Sometimes when a deer will browse, they will consume the entire leaf petiole, the whole structure of the leaf. So you can't really tell that there's a bite. You need to be looking at stems, non-lignified twig stems, to do a browse analysis. But even if you don't go to that extent, where you're actually physically counting the number of bites on species of plants, macroscopic evaluations can be telling. And again, that's just looking at things. Browse surveys are fairly easy to identify. These are all photos from properties that I've been on, and it's very easy to see that. You'll notice, not only do you notice the browse survey or the browse lines, but the herbaceous vegetation in the foregrounds is also a pretty good indication that you've got some problems going on. There's no residual grass cover. There's no diversity of good preferred foods, meaning that deer are forced to eat browse species, even if they don't want to, just in order to survive. And in high density situations, they can have a very noticeable effect on the browse line, and you can see that pretty evidently here. But even aside from browse lines, you also have hedging issues where if you go to an individual plant and see that there is such intense grazing pressure that the growth of that plant is being affected, like the second and the fourth photos, then you know deer are really having to focus on certain plants because other foods are limited, and you probably have nutritional problems in your deer herd. And then you take things like eastern red cedar, where you hope to not see any use. You don't want to see any use on cedar. So when you do see excessive use, like you do in these photos, that's a pretty good indication that you've got some problems within your deer herd. Another thing you can look at is exclosures. You normally think of forage exclosures in terms of food plots, where you hope to see, or you want to see, something less than 50% utilization. That's where you normally see these. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You could also put exclosures on your native habitat to see what differences you find. And once you establish one of these exclosures, over time, you can look within that exclosure and see if you see different species. Even if you don't know what they are, just look and see if you see different species that are occurring there that do not occur outside of the fence where deer and other animals have access to them. So you can look at the species composition, and you can also look at the biomass, the amount of forage that's being produced. Now, you're going to see some impact, but you hope to not see significant impacts to the amount of the forage that's being eaten. This is a good example from a property I went to. It was about 1,000 acres. Most of the property, the whole 1,000 acres, looked like the little area on the right, but they had one fenced off area that was protecting that tank battery. And within that enclosure, it wasn't even meant to be an exclosure. It was just an area they had fenced off. And it was very evident once you went inside there, you could see different species composition. Here, you mainly see broom sedge blue stem. I think there's one little blue stem in there. But once you got in it, you could look down in there and see many different kinds of forbs or weeds or broadleaf plants that were coming up in there that weren't coming up outside the exclosure. So it was very much evident. Now, in this situation, it's probably realistically more related to mowing practices and grazing practices. But at the same time, even if it wasn't deer that was doing it, you know that you're still going to have nutritional problems within your deer herd because that forage just simply isn't available. It doesn't matter how you got to where you are. The fact that nutrition is limited means you're going to have problems within your deer herd. This was a good forested example. This was an area where there was essentially, the photo on the left, there was essentially no forest rejuvenation going on at all. And I guess from some aspects, it may look attractive, like a park-like setting, a clear understory. But what was going on is the deer densities were so extreme that no plants were rejuvenating or regenerating in that ecosystem. So they took part of that forest, fenced it off, high fenced it, made sure there was no deer in it. And just immediately after they did that, saw an explosion of growth that they weren't getting outside the exclosure. So these are just examples to show what sort of impact that deer have on the habitat. And just by your visual inspection of the habitat, you can kind of make some educated decisions on your deer herd on maybe reducing your deer density so that you can increase the nutritional plane, not just for deer, but for all wildlife species. So I'll end on this. We went through a lot of that very quickly. I'd encourage you to contact your local biologist, whether that be Texas Parks and Wildlife, Extension, NRCS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, whoever. Call somebody if you have questions about habitat management on your property. And that, I know from a Parks and Wildlife standpoint, this is our main function. That's the main reason we're here, is to assist landowners with management on their property. So you can go to that top link, take a little screenshot or something. That top link, you can find every biologist for every county in the state. There's always going to be at least 2 listed. If you need my contact information, that's listed below. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, Billy. Appreciate that presentation. That was great information. If you all have any questions for Billy, please put them into the question and answer box and he can address them there. So with that, we'd like to thank all of our door prize sponsors: Bamert Seed, InView Range and Pasture, Native American Seed Company, Quail Forever, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. And we appreciate their support here for the 16th Plant Party. So thanks again to all of our speakers and to you for attending the plant party. Again, this is a quarterly webinar, Advanced Plant Training series brought to you by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. We will be sending a link to a short survey by email, or you can type in the address you see there on the screen and chat box, or we'll pop up the QR code that you can simply hold your phone camera over and click on the link that pops up. Our next plant party will be on December 11th on the Plant Manager's Christmas Wish List. Join us for some favorite things submitted by our fellow plant managing and plant loving Texans, and you won't want to miss it. We will send an email with more information to all the past registrants, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.